Hi there, my name's Don and welcome to Project Urtle. In this episode we're going to be covering the construction of the chassis for the camper van. Okay, so having developed the design for the chassis, it was time to go out into the workshop and start cutting metal in earnest. As mentioned before, the chassis uses a ladder frame which sits as low as possible and parallel to the truck's chassis. To mount those on, we cut small slots into the side of the chassis rails, which allowed us to insert bolts, polyurethane bushes and large washers to allow movement between the camper van's body chassis and the truck's chassis. Truck chassis don't sit rigidly like you might imagine. They do flex as you're going over hills and hollows, and so this gives a little bit of flex to allow movement between the two. So once having set out the two longitudinal rails, we started filling in across the ladder rungs. The one at the rear, because of an offset in the chassis mounting points, is also 75 by 50 square section or rectangular section tube. Now I need to introduce you to the man in the mask. That's my brother-in-law Adrian, and he did, thankfully, all the welding on the chassis for me. He, like myself, is an amateur maker. He comes from an IT background, and on retirement has filled his time with making all sorts of things, predominantly in metal. So he was the obvious choice to come in onto this part of the project. In order to weld aluminium, which is a reasonably straightforward thing to do when you have the right equipment, and we're using a TIG welding process here. Aluminium corrodes like crazy. Now you might say, what? No, it doesn't. Well, it does. It corrodes extremely fast. It oxidizes very, very quickly, and it's that oxidization on the surface of that aluminium that protects it. Once a small layer of oxidization on the surface of the aluminium occurs, it basically stops oxygen getting in any further and corroding further. So in order to weld aluminium successfully by this method, you really need to scratch through that oxide layer, and Adrian uses a stainless steel wire brush to do that. He then does a quick wipe with alcohol and to remove grease, and then you can start welding using an argon gas submerged arc, and his welds come out really nice. So cross members were 50mm by 50mm by 3mm angle, and after having bolted down the two long members, we tacked in the cross members. At this point, it's really, really important that we manage distortion, and heat distortion is one of the major problems with any welding job. And we have basically tacked all the upper surfaces of this frame, checked the diagonals, and made sure it is square and flat. Having done that, it was time to move the frame off the chassis, turn it over, and start to weld the undersides of all those joints. Now here we are with the chassis off and turned over, and you can see that we've got some areas that we need to tidy up a little bit and finish welding everything on the underneath side. To do that, I made some quick little spacer blocks that would allow us to bolt the chassis back onto the truck We also used a couple of pieces of steel angle iron, some steel 50 by 50 rectangular hollow section tube that we clamped up underneath it all to keep things square and straight. And clamps, you've never got enough clamps whenever you do any job. And I used every clamp that I had, right down to the last one. But with a fair bit of success, we managed to keep this frame straight and square. But there's just hours and hours of welding in there. This is Adrian's welder. I'm not a welder. I don't really know anything about it, except that I think it uses pulsed welding process and argon gas as its shield. Throughout, I've been cutting this aluminium just on my regular woodworker's table saw. The only thing I changed is I changed out my nice good quality super fine sharp woodworking saw blade for my oldest tungsten tipped blade, and although it didn't do a perfect cut, it did a cut that was very well suited to this kind of work. In order to get nice clean straight square cuts, I used my homemade crosscut sled, and that's good because I'm able to clamp a piece into that, and it has the added advantage of deflecting a large amount of the chips, hot aluminium chips that fly off the blade towards the operator. Of course, wearing the correct protective equipment at this stage is vitally important. I'm wearing a full face shield, hearing protection and gloves because those little bits coming off there are hot and nasty. Having completed the backbone, we then started building the peripheral sections, and the peripheral sections are what are taking the outer walls and holding the 4 bins that are located in the 4 corners of the chassis. The bins we constructed out of 3mm flat plate and basically completed those out on the bench before adding them in to the frame. At this stage it took a little bit of head scratching because we were working upside down and backwards, and there was a few mistakes made which we had to cut out and start again, but that's part of the course. This front section here is made of aluminium checker plate, and that part will hang actually down quite low behind the cab of the truck and will be subject to a fair bit of abuse by stones coming up off the road, and so the checker plate pattern there provides a bit of a disguise to the peppering that it's going to get. Once again, you can see Adrian's really nice welding here. So this bin and one on the other side will be for tools, spare parts, recovery equipment, etc., and will be accessed with a hatch through the sidewalls. Here I'm cutting the sidewalls for the stairway. The stairs are built in much the same way as the bins, except that it's open vertically above, and will allow me to step into the van before I have to step up onto the floor level of the van, and that means that I can have a lower overall height when we're travelling, but still have a reasonably high doorway to make getting in and out easier. This is a fairly standard thing to do on caravans with pop tops. So there's the stairway in there. We've run the angle members on the lower edge straight through at this point in time, even though there's going to be a wheel well there. But at this stage, leaving that aluminium running straight through helped us keep everything square and aligned. By doing multiple small tacks around the edge of the bins as we were assembling them, we could keep it square, and then you'd go back in and fill in with full welds. Now we're ready for our first trial fit. As you can see, it's not too hard for two guys to pick it up, move it around. But one of the things we discovered at this stage was that our tolerances were just a little too fine. What works on paper doesn't always work in reality, and we had a bit of interference between the construction chassis and the truck's chassis. And after much grunting and pulling and poking, etc., we decided that we really needed to modify the truck chassis rather than go back and modify the work we'd done on the aluminium chassis. So, get the chassis out of the way, get the angle grinder out, and do something that I didn't really want to do. But in actual fact, I haven't taken any strength or strength is the right word, out of the truck chassis. There was a small web on the side of the chassis mount here, which had a slight curve in it that protruded outwards from the mounting point, and we just needed to take a little bit off that edge. Amounted to about 3 millimeters. So out with the angle grinder and a flapper disc, and we just trimmed that down a little bit. So once again, it was time for another trial fit, and this time it went on without a problem. And here's our imitation of two ducks feeding at the water, and needless to say, Adrian was well pleased. He had worries about having to cut this thing open and modify it, but that wasn't necessary. The next job was to make the grey water tank, which will sit in the back driver's side corner. This is a baffle to stop surge in the water tank from coming back up the inlet. And Adrian turned up this lovely little threaded outlet for me on his lathe. By getting these panels lined up really well, Adrian's able to weld them together with almost no filler rod in there, just by fusing the two parts together. Takes a little bit of gentle persuasion sometimes to pull it into shape. Then it's tacked all the way around in multiple places, and then welded in little runs of about 3-4 inches at a time to stop distortion. And when he's finished, Adrian's left a lovely looking weld. So the tank is now ready for fitting into the chassis. We've added tags onto the side of it, and the tank will be bolted in rather than welded in, so that we have the option of taking it out in the future should it need servicing of some sort. Then there was just a bunch of finish off work around there, finish off the back of the chassis. And then it was time to build the wheel arches and mudguards. The little bandsaw also does a very good job of cutting aluminium. Okay, so I'll flatten that a little bit. So little light mudguards were welded in underneath, and that turned out fairly well. And then a bit of cleanup. There were a few sharp corners and daggy bits that needed to be just cleaned off with a flapper disc. Surprisingly little, really. And then it was time to weigh it. Out with the bathroom scales, and wow, 57.4 kilos. Very pleased with that. So now it was time to put it on for the last time. Bolt it down. And if my backside wasn't so big, it would have gone very easily. But, well, we'll work our way around that eventually. Putting the I can't think of the name, polyurethane buffers and washers and nuts and everything up a very narrow space into the bottom of the chassis there, led me to think that maybe what we could do is make a licorice all sort. I've stuck the nuts, the washers and the bushes together using a little bit of super glue so that we can sit it on the end of the socket and push it up and line it up and bolt it in all in one go. Otherwise it was almost impossible. So here's a quick walk around of the outside. One of the things I haven't talked about before was the lip around the bottom edge of the chassis all the way, and that's to accept the Styromax panels. The Styromax panels perform better if they've got something to sit on and something to glue against, and so that's how we've designed the outer edges of the chassis. Just can't wait until I get these panels here. So that's the completion of the chassis build, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and maybe subscribe if you want to see the rest of the series, and maybe hit that bell notification too to let you know when a new one arrives. Next episode will cover some of the smaller jobs, putting the deck on the chassis, building a shower pan, refitting the fuel tank filler system, and a couple of other little sundry jobs like that. Cheers.